All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for being here today in person. It's exciting to start to have larger and larger groups coming back for these events. I know a number of people are also joining us online. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the American Statecraft program here at Carnegie, and I'm delighted to have the chance to spend the next hour talking to Philip Taubman, who is currently a lecturer at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Philip also has had a long career as a journalist, primarily with the New York Times. He's the author of a number of very well received and acclaimed books on international affairs. But we're here to talk primarily about his latest book, which has just come out last week, The Life and Times of George Shultz, in the Nation's Service. I read it in great detail over the course of the last week. I found it really, really stimulating, and it really uncovers a strain, I think, of American statecraft that is perhaps missing from our discussion today. So I hope that we can get to that over the course of the next hour. But before we start, I just wanted to say thanks for coming and doing this for us today.
It's my pleasure, and I want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for inviting me.
Great. So you knew George Shultz.
I met George Shultz for the first time on an Air Force plane as he was Secretary of State, headed to an ASEAN meeting in Manila. You know, I was a reporter at that time for the New York Times, kind of my debut on the diplomatic beat. He received me, you know, properly on the plane, introduced himself, introduced his aides, I spent the next basically 10 days circling the globe with him. You know, we were only supposed to get as far as India and Pakistan, and then at the last minute he decided to add stops in Israel, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so we made the full circumnavigation of the world. And the man I knew in those days was, very circumspect. His nickname, I think, at the State Department was the Sphinx. He was kind of inscrutable and was a great listener. And reserved his views until later in the decision-making process.
Also known as the Buddha.
And the Buddha.
Yeah.
And then on a subsequent trip, got to see a little of the personal George Shultz because his aide had heard I liked to play tennis and said, on the next trip that you come on, bring your tennis racket. So I did, and I got a call one afternoon in Rio in the hotel. The secretary would like to play tennis. The car will be downstairs in 15 minutes. So, I threw on my tennis gear, grabbed my racket, went down, got in the car with him and the State Department physician, and we went to a club, and it was probably one of the few times in my life where I played tennis where there were people to retrieve the balls and bring them back, like at Wimbledon or the US Open, where the State Department doctor was standing at courtside with his medical bag in case the secretary had a heart attack.
It doesn't show much confidence in his state of health, I have to say. For a man who lived to be 100.
Right, yeah, no, that doctor was not necessary. So we played tennis, and it was fun, and I was trying to, beat him, obviously. I didn't feel constrained. But he got back all the shots, so it was interesting. As I got to know him better, his tennis game was very much a reflection of the man. Very steady, returned everything, not flashy, great stamina, so that's how I met George Shultz.
That's great, and as you say, he was a well-liked Secretary of State, and also one who survived for a long time in a very tumultuous Reagan administration. So I want to talk about his philosophy of statecraft and why he was such a successful Secretary of State. But before we do that, I want to talk specifically about his role in helping to bring the Cold War to an end, because it's a really critical part of history that I think historians, obviously some good work has been done on this, but we're going to continue to be arguing about for a while. And your book makes an important contribution to understanding that. Obviously, you talk about Schultz's whole life, But the bulk of the story here is really about his time in the Reagan administration, even though he had served already 3 times, correct, as a cabinet level secretary by the time he became Secretary of State, which is really I didn't remember that, I have to admit. So it was good to be reminded of that. But let's talk specifically about his role in bringing the Cold War to an end. And I want to read one passage here, which for me I think is sort of iconic as an image of the mood of that time. And you're writing about the Washington summit in the series of summits that took place at the end of the Reagan administration. And you're writing about Gorbachev's spontaneous decision to hop out of his motorcade and walk around in a crowd here on, I guess it must have been around K Street and Connecticut Avenue.
K in Connecticut.
And so you write, on the final day of the summit, and this had been, I guess, a couple of days of meetings with President Reagan, after hosting Vice President Bush for breakfast at the Russian embassy, Gorbachev headed to the White House for a last meeting with Reagan. As the Gorbachev-Bush motorcade rolled by the corner of Connecticut Avenue and K Street, it came to a stop, and Gorbachev bounded out of his limousine to greet people who had assembled at the intersection in hopes of seeing his car pass by. As Secret Service agents scrambled to catch up with Gorbachev, he stepped to the sidewalk, working the crowd like a veteran American political candidate. He seemed to relish the spontaneous encounter, as did the people he greeted. The scene all but shouted to the world that the Cold War was ending. Great image.
I was right there on the sidewalk. We were following, the New York Times bureau in those days was at K in Connecticut. And we were following on television the scene all through Washington as the motorcade went. All the sidewalks were jammed with people. It was the most extraordinary moment. It was as if Winston Churchill were coming here at the end of World War II. Instead, it's the Kremlin leader. And so, we could see the progress of the limo. We could see it was stopping at the corner down the street. And a few of us just raced down the stairs from the New York Times bureau down the sidewalk. So I was right there on the sidewalk as he stepped out, and as you can see, it made a huge impression on me.
So here's the question: so if this was sort of one of those moments where there was clearly had been a major sea change in U.S.-Soviet relations, when Schultz came into office back in 1982, he faced a whole, horde of different challenges. So I want to talk a little bit about the situation when he came into office and how we got from there, those challenges that he faced, to these sort of, extraordinary summits at the end of the Reagan administration. So tell me a little bit about the situation when he first came into office.
So remember, he was successor to Alexander Haig, who was the first Secretary of State, who flamed out. He didn't get along well with the president or the chief circle of advisors around Reagan. And the day Reagan was shot outside the Washington Hilton here, Vice President Bush was out of town, and he raced Haig into the press room at the White House and said, "I'm in charge here," which rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because, while he was in the line of succession, he was not second in the line of succession. So that was kind of the coup de grace for him. He had previously declared himself to be the vicar of American foreign policy, which also annoyed the president. So they turned to Schultz, who, by the way, had been a candidate when Reagan was president-elect.
For Secretary of State.
Yeah, he had served, as you noted, in 3 cabinet posts under Nixon, including Treasury at the end. And so there was a kind of, what Jim Baker told me was a blown signal, where Reagan was thinking of offering the Secretary of State job to Schultz while, Haig was in consideration. Reagan calls Schultz, who's in California. He's at the Bechtel Company, and starts out the conversation by saying, essentially, "George, I know you don't want to come back to Washington. You've got a great life in California." And Reagan never gets to the point of saying, "Would you be interested in being Secretary of State?" Because Reagan was under the impression that Schultz didn't want to come back again, maybe to be Treasury Secretary. Okay, he's invited. Later, when Haig is pushed out, he comes in, and he's got a couple of serious disadvantages for Secretary of State. The main one being he doesn't really know the president very well. He does not have a close relationship with the president. And secretaries of state rise or fall heavily on their relationship with the president they serve. Secondly, he had very limited experience in foreign policy and national security affairs. As Secretary of Treasury, he had dealt with some international economic issues. So he arrives and he doesn't really know the president, and he doesn't really know what the president's views are. So those of you who were here in those days will remember that Reagan was very bombastic about the Soviet Union. He issued all these belligerent declarations, the evil empire, communism's going to end up on the ash heap of history. There was agreement with Congress and the Reagan administration to pump tens of billions of dollars into the defense budget to build up America's defenses. And so he looked like an adamant Cold Warrior. Schultz arrived determined to try to end the Cold War. Now, I think that's hard to believe when you look back. But Bob Woodward told me the other day, and I understood this from my research, but not quite this explicitly. He went to a dinner, sat next to O.B. Schultz, George's wife, within the first year of Schultz's arrival here, and said, you know, what are your husband's goals as Secretary of State? And she didn't hesitate for a second. She said, end the Cold War.
I just want to point out that one of the things that really struck me in reading this about that is that he certainly was no sympathizer with communism. No. Just to make this clear, I mean, he was a fan of Milton Friedman, so he was coming at this from a completely alternative ideological perspective.
Yeah, listen, he was fully in favor of the defense buildup.
Yep.
But in his core, he felt that the tensions with the Kremlin were dangerous because of the potential of nuclear war. And interestingly, Reagan felt the same way, even though it wasn't so publicly clear at that time. I would take you back to the pre-Schultz period in the Reagan administration. Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, sent a letter, boilerplate, to the president. The State Department under Haig put together a boilerplate response. They sent it to Reagan, and he said, no, you know, I don't like this. And he wrote his own letter to Brezhnev by hand. And it was appalling to Haig and the senior advisors, because it was this kind of innocent, idealistic notion that the two peoples, the Russians and the Americans, could get together. There was no need for this animosity. And he gave it back to the State Department, and they sort of looked at it. They rejiggered it a little bit, sent it back, and it was still pretty much the way they had started. Reagan took a look at it and said, here's what I want you to do. Send your letter, but also send my letter. So Schultz didn't know this at the time, but if you go back and look at that letter, and it's available publicly, you'll see this kind of inner Reagan, this peacemaker Reagan that was not obvious at the time. So in his first months and years as Secretary of State, Schultz struggled mightily to come to an understanding of what Reagan really wanted, to get access to Reagan, to figure that out. And he was blocked at every turn by the people around Reagan. Caspar Weinberger was not keenly interested in improving relations with the Soviet Union. Bill Casey certainly wasn't the CIA director. Bill Clark, the national security advisor, who had even less foreign policy experience than George Schultz, sort of shared the hardline view. And so Schultz was, I went back and looked at this, he threatened to resign numerous times. He was so frustrated about his inability. At one point, he said to his aide, Raymond Seitz, some of you may have known Seitz, who was his executive assistant. He said, you know, there's disarray in the decision-making process. At one point, he said, this is the worst organization I've ever seen. It's even worse than a university. And I remember he'd been dean of the business school at the University of Chicago. He just spent the first year hitting his head against the wall. It was enormously frustrating for him.
Yeah, and so you sum this up in a passage here. You write about these challenges that he faced. So you've got not only the hawkishness of Reagan and his statements about the Soviet Union, but also these internal bureaucratic politics, which were really rough on him, especially in the beginning. You write, the uncompromising policies of the Reagan administration had hardened over Reagan's first year in office. Alliances among conservatives within the administration had formed. many contemptuous of diplomacy. Access to the president was tightly controlled by a national security advisor who rejected Schultz's worldview. Although Schultz was an experienced government official, he was not temperamentally suited to waging and winning internal power struggles. And as OB, this is his wife, once said of her husband, he dreaded confrontation and far preferred to talk through problems. He was surprisingly innocent about the Reagan White House and the world, but nevertheless he succeeds. So what is it that changes?
Well, you know, to understand George Shultz, you really have to understand the core of the man. He was the consummate pragmatic problem solver. He was not ideologically driven. He was not driven by partisanship. He had spent his whole life trying to resolve problems. And in fact, his work as a labor economist had focused on negotiation between corporation leaders and unions. So he came into office, he saw the Cold War as a problem, not as a crusade, a problem to solve. And it's interesting when you look back at it, he was an outsider in some ways. Yes, he had served in 3 cabinet posts under Nixon, but he had grown up in New York. He was not a creature of Washington. Ronald Reagan was not a creature of Washington. Grew up in California, Illinois, California, actor, governor of California. So the two men arrived in Washington without, I think, a heavy investment in the entire Cold War doctrines of the United States. They were ready to think new about how to deal with the Soviet Union. And so George just kept hammering away, trying to get time with Reagan. Eventually, the breakthrough came on a snowy night here in February '83. Washington was paralyzed. The Reagans had planned to go to Camp David. They couldn't get up there. So Nancy Reagan calls the Schultzes in Bethesda and says, come on over for dinner. Schultz didn't realize it, but that was Mother Nature was playing a role, but Nancy Reagan was looking for this opportunity because she was concerned her husband was going to go down in history as a warmonger. They come over to the White House, and for the first time, Schultz and Reagan really have a conversation about U.S.-Soviet relations. And that began
without anyone else there. I think
just
being part of
the
key,
two spouses, and that was
without
it.
Weinberg or Clark or
Nobody
Casey,
else
no one was
was
there.
there. And it was at that moment, I think, that Schultz realized that they agreed in a fundamental way about what needed to be done. And that was the beginning of the diplomatic effort that played out over 6 more years. You know, nothing happened overnight. Indeed, Schultz continued to run into remarkable resistance about everything he wanted to do from people around the president. And the president continued in many ways to remain kind of disengaged from the battles that were going on. But it did lead to an important moment, which was the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin had wanted to meet with the president. So remember now, we're almost 2 years into the Reagan presidency. He's never met with the Soviet ambassador at this point, which is kind of unheard of in the Cold War, that you would go that long. Schultz says to the president, Dobrynin's coming over to see me next week. Why don't I bring him over to the Oval Office? Reagan says, please. Brings him over to the White House, expects to have a 10, 15-minute conversation with Reagan. Turns into a 2-hour conversation with the president. And at the end of it, they come to a sort of, you know, informal agreement that they're going to work together on a specific human rights problem, which is the group of Pentecostals who had sought refuge in the American embassy in Moscow because they were under attack by the Soviet authorities. And the embassy had taken them in. They had, in effect, become wards of the United States, living in the basement. And at that meeting, Dobrynin agreed he would go back to Moscow and see if some progress could be made toward getting them freed. And indeed, progress was made. They were eventually freed and allowed to emigrate. And the deal that Reagan made with Dobrynin, when you think about the way things go on in East-West relations today, you think of the contrast to this. The president said, if you release them, I'm not going to go out and say, I got them out. You know, I put pressure on the Soviet leadership. You know, I deserve credit for this. I'm the hero. Said nothing. They just got out.
So they begin the diplomacy, and it's still Andropov in power, right?
Well,
but
it's
not for very long.
Brezhnev
But
and
so
then
Brezhnev at the beginning, right?
Andropov.
Okay, right.
You know, you have this series of Soviet leaders who are dying.
Which has to complicate things.
You know, you went Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, who was really half dead when he took the job. And so there was nobody to talk to in Moscow.
Yep.
And I think, you know, you have to understand, Schultz was struggling to get traction here in Washington, but even had he gotten full traction, it might have been very difficult to make progress with the Kremlin. So the real opening, 85 was a crucial year because by then Schultz had begun to earn Reagan's trust. He had begun to figure out ways to get beyond the opposition around Reagan. And here comes Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow, younger man, fresh thinking, ready to talk about easing Cold War tensions.
But that wasn't evident to everyone at the time, was it? Because I mean, it's clear again from reading this. You know, the analysis that the CIA was doing, the views of the Defense Department were that he was going to be no different from any other Cold War leader of the Soviet Union.
You know, that analysis, I'm sorry to report, continued right up through the end of the Reagan administration. I went through all these CIA assessments, which have all been declassified, and they consistently reported that Gorbachev, despite all the things that he wound up doing, was basically a fresh face on an old policy. But Schultz recognized that it was different. He went to Moscow for the memorial service and funeral for Chernenko, and Gorbachev received him and Bush afterward. They talked for about an hour, and after the meeting, Schultz reported to his aides, basically, there's been a sea change in the Kremlin. And Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister, asked him, who'd also gone to the memorial service, you know, when do you think there'll be change here? And George Schultz, in effect, said, it started today.
So that's really the moment when things really start to move towards this series of summits.
Right.
First in Geneva, then the emergency summit, or the last-minute summit in Reykjavik, then Washington, and then finally Moscow.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about how those progress, or what was most important in each of them?
Yeah, and in each case, believe it or not, even as the summits proceeded, Schultz continued to have to struggle to keep this diplomacy on track. So the first summit was in Geneva, and you know, it was the first time Reagan had met a Soviet leader. Not much was accomplished at Geneva in a substantive way in terms of agreements, but there was a declaration that they issued at the end of the summit that the press, myself included, didn't quite understand the import of. It was this declaration that a nuclear war could never be won and should never be fought. And that actually was an important statement that reflected the actual views of Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, and I believe of Mikhail Gorbachev and his foreign minister at that point, Edward Shevardnadze. And there was a great moment in Geneva which tells you a lot about Schultz and the way he did business. So some of you may remember there was an opportunity on the first day. The Americans hosted the first day. They went down to a little house by the shore of Lake Geneva. There were two nice, comfortable armchairs, and it was just Reagan and Gorbachev and their translators. And they were supposed to be down there, I forget for how long, maybe 40 minutes, and they kept talking and talking. And at one point, Don Regan, the White House chief of staff, says to an aide, you know, you better go tell the secretary that this is running overtime and the whole summit schedule is going to get disrupted. So this poor young guy comes to George Schultz, who's not in the meeting. He's up at the main house and says, Mr. Secretary, shouldn't we break up this meeting down at the lakeside house? And Schultz explodes at this young guy and says, what? Are you crazy, basically? You know, let them talk. So that was a classic George Schultz impulse. The heck with the schedule. I don't care what the schedule is. These guys are getting to know each other, so let them talk.
It's also indicative of how, you know, how surprising and extraordinary that summit was.
Right.
I mean, we take it for granted now that these things happened, and I think we have to remind ourselves that the idea that the American president and Soviet leader are toasting each other over the table in a multi-day summit. I mean, it was really remarkable, right?
It was the first summit in many, many years. And it was in some ways a breakthrough, but a subdued one, I would say. Mm-hmm. But on their walk back up to the main house that they were meeting in, the two leaders agreed to Reagan's surprise. They agreed that Gorbachev would come to Washington and that Reagan would go to Moscow. And so that in itself was kind of a bit of a breakthrough. But then you get to creating the second meeting when Gorbachev's supposed to come to Washington. And it didn't happen, and it didn't happen, and it didn't happen. Reagan becomes restive. Some of his aides are saying, this is going nowhere, Mr. Mm-hmm. President. Gorbachev is becoming very impatient that they're not finding a way to get this done.
And he's also under pressure.
He's under pressure.
Yeah, uh-huh.
And then the whole thing turns on a dime because an American correspondent in Moscow is arrested. Nicholas Daniloff, the bureau chief of U.S. News and World Report, who was set up by the KGB. They entrapped him, they arrested him, they put him in prison, and suddenly there's a crisis in U.S.-Soviet relations. And it was up to George Shultz and Edward Shevardnadze to figure out how to resolve this crisis. And they spent hours working on it. You would think it wasn't that hard to do, but it was a sudden, very tense moment. Schultz and Shevardnadze figured it out how to do it. It involved an exchange with a KGB agent in New York who'd been arrested by the FBI. And as they announced that, and as the two men under arrest in New York and Moscow were on their way home, they announced that Gorbachev and Reagan would meet in Reykjavik. It was the SNAP summit. And it turned out to be a turning point in the Cold War. And it was a surprise, I think, to the Americans. They weren't quite sure what to expect. There was not the usual months of preparation and negotiation by the so-called Sherpas, to the assistant and deputy secretaries of this and that, to essentially work out agreements that the leaders would
Which is why it went almost all through the night. If I remember, Paul Nitze who was the lead negotiator for the United States.
So they get to Reykjavik, and Gorbachev basically pulls a surprise because he had planned for the summit with the Politburo. And when you go look at the Politburo records, they're available, thankfully. Thanks to Boris Yeltsin, by the way. They're here in Washington at the National Security Archive. Gorbachev said to the Politburo, we can't afford to keep spending all this money on defense. Our economy is crashing, and believe me, it was. I was based in Moscow at that time, and you would go to dinner with Soviet families at, by the way, considerable risk to them to have an American reporter come to their homes. And the pièce de résistance on the dinner table were boiled potatoes because they couldn't get meat. The economy was in a kind of meltdown. So Gorbachev comes intending to try to drive major agreements with Reagan on the spot. And Reagan comes kind of uncertain what to do, but before coming, Weinberger had agreed to major cuts in ballistic missiles. And so they get there, and this negotiation opens up again at in this case, it was a seaside house in Reykjavik. And all of a sudden, they're sitting there talking about abolishing nuclear weapons entirely. It's an extraordinary idea that presidents of the United States had verbally supported dating back to Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. But it never really had gotten the kind of serious attention that it deserved to actually abolish nuclear weapons. And there's Reagan and Schultz and Gorbachev and Shevardnadze in the room saying, let's do it. They couldn't do it because Reagan wouldn't give up the strategic defense.
What I was going to say, I mean, and the reason why it didn't work ultimately is that despite his interest in, changing the relationship with the Soviets, his genuine belief that nuclear weapons were evil, he was for some reason completely enthralled with the idea of Star Wars missile, what we call today, missile defense, and that was a huge frustration for Schultz.
It was frustrating, but he backed
him nonetheless.
Schultz, this was an interesting thing with Schultz. When he first heard about the Star Wars initiative, which was just a day or two before Reagan was supposed to go on national television to announce it. They had bypassed the Secretary of State in planning this whole initiative. He went to the president, he said, this is technologically infeasible. I'm not an expert, but I've talked to experts. Reagan said, no, we're going to go ahead. He tried to get Reagan to adjust the wording of the speech that he would give, and they made a few minor changes. But as soon as Reagan was done speaking to the nation on television, Schultz basically said, I'm all for it. And when you look back at SDI, it's interesting. It was a double-edged sword. I give them credit. I have sort of understood at the time as a reporter talking to scientists that it was a fantasy at the time. It still is. Maybe, you know, in a future generation, something will be developed. But it was a lot of leverage on the Kremlin, and it was effective leverage. I think that's one of the reasons that Gorbachev went to the Politburo and said, we've got to make a deal in Reykjavik. Where I fault Reagan and Schultz is when the deal's on the table, they refuse to compromise. And Gorbachev gave them a compromise. You know, I won't get into the details about the conditions under which you could develop anti-missile systems under the ABM treaty, but Gorbachev basically said, how about a 10-year deal where you restrict work on the Strategic Defense Initiative to the laboratory? And Reagan said, no deal. I asked Schultz about this years later, and I said, did you ever think to explore the issue of what laboratory definition was? Supposing laboratory definition allowed you to do everything you could do at this early stage of the technology we're trying to develop. And he nodded and he said, you know, we should have thought of that. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, the summit blew up, and that was the impression we had. I went to Reykjavik, but the summit blew up, and underneath the blow up, they had made enormous progress on all sorts of issues, including an agreement to eliminate intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe. And you know, within a year, Gorbachev gave ground on the demands he was making for that agreement, and he came to Washington, and they signed that agreement. That was when he was here, when all the crowds came out. And then, you know, in '88, Reagan went to Moscow, and that was an equally astounding moment where Reagan's out on Red Square with Gorbachev. I still gives me chills to think about this. There's the President of the United States in Red Square, and it's probably standing as far from me as the gentleman here in the first row is the U.S. military officer with the codes to launch a nuclear war, the so-called football that's always within reach of the president at any moment, day or night, in case he has to launch a nuclear strike. They're standing there in Red Square, and you know, where are the nuclear weapons going to hit? Right there in Moscow. And Sam Donaldson, this obstreperous you know, correspondent for ABC, who was famous for shouting out questions and loudly and kind of startling the presidents he covered. He's standing there in Red Square and he shouts out, Mr. President, is it still the evil empire? And Reagan looks at him and says, it was a different time and a different place.
So it was not technically the end of the Cold War, but it was, you know, there had been an enormous sea change in the relationship, and I think it's so important. And so you talk a little bit about this in the introduction, but you know, on reading your book, it occurred to me how inadequate our sort of popular imagination of Reagan's role in ending the Cold War sometimes is, because there tends to be a very heavy emphasis on the defense spending and the evil empire and the toughness and hawkishness of the Reagan administration. And that was definitely there, and I think it did have some role, but there was the Schultz side too. So how should we be thinking about the end of the Cold War from this perspective?
Well, you know, the way I put it, and I think this is critical to understand, I think Reagan did have this inner drive to bring the Cold War to an end. It was obscured. What Schultz was, and by the way, when you get to the end of Reagan's first term and you look at the state of diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's basically at a standstill. And so my interpretation, which Colin Powell and others agreed with, and you can see that in the book, is that Reagan came in, he put the Kremlin on notice that he was a hardliner with his rhetoric. He built up American defenses. He launched the Strategic Defense Initiative. He put the Kremlin back on its heels. They didn't know what the hell was going to happen. Was this guy crazy? But he didn't know how to execute once he had done that. He didn't know how to get a negotiation started. And it was George Shultz who showed him how to do that. It was George Shultz who designed the diplomacy with Gorbachev that led to winding down the Cold War. And it was George Shultz who executed that diplomacy in hundreds of hours of negotiation with Edward Shevardnadze. And so when you go back and look at the end of the Cold War and the Reagan administration, you know, that's really the key Shultz role. Both Kissinger, whom I talked to too, and Colin Powell, they essentially said the same thing, which is when you go back and look at the George Shultz-Ronald Reagan relationship, George Shultz was able to translate the basic impulses of Ronald Reagan into policy and diplomacy. And had George Shultz not been appointed Secretary of State, I don't know that we would have gotten to the place we got in the Reagan administration.
The point that you make about translating Reagan's basic impulses into policy is one that he perhaps learned from Johnson, if I remember correctly. You have this interesting quotation in there about Johnson. Can you just briefly relay that?
Well, you know, first of all, Schultz was a kind of negotiator for labor management issues, so he had a kind of impulse of how to do that. But he had an interesting meeting with Lyndon Johnson when Johnson was president. You know, obviously Johnson was a Democrat, Schultz was a Republican, so he wasn't deeply involved in the Johnson administration. But Johnson brought him in to get his advice a couple of times on economic issues. And he's sitting there with Johnson one day talking about something, and LBJ leans into him the way he leaned into everybody, and he said to Schultz, you know something? I got to tell you something, George. When you got an idea, and it's your idea, it isn't going anywhere. But when it's my idea, it's going somewhere. And so that was an important moment for Schultz to understand that, you know, if he has an impulse, if he has a strategy, which he did have to try to wind down the Cold War, it's got to become Ronald Reagan's strategy or it's going nowhere.
Good. Yeah, I love that connection over the years. So I want to be sure that we have an opportunity to take questions from people who are here in the audience and also online. So as we're sort of starting to collect those, I wanted to just go over a couple more or dig down a little bit more on the question of, you know, Schultz's philosophy of statecraft or his approach to statecraft, actually. And I have another passage here that I wanted to read where you sort of hit on some of the basic points. You write, to a surprising degree, and you're talking about a speech that Reagan had gave. This speech echoed Schultz's own thoughts about the need to blend military strength and firmness with a faith in dialogue with adversaries and a willingness to seek common ground and ease Cold War tensions. He thought a different kind of relationship with the Soviet Union might be possible. Not friendship, partnership, or even collaboration, but perhaps a more civil discourse about disagreements and some cooperation to check, even reverse, the frightening growth in nuclear arsenals on both sides and the reliance in Washington and Moscow on doctrines on fighting a nuclear war that called for the obliteration of American and Soviet society. So that was his basic approach, was to be tough, but also to be open to negotiation. And when he negotiated, there's another point in here where you point out he got really frustrated with the Defense Department because he said something like, the Defense Department says they want to negotiate, but they're not willing to give anything up. But that's the nature of negotiation, is we have to be willing to bargain to some degree. So can you talk a little bit about that?
You know, I think in today's Washington, George Shultz might be viewed as a appeaser. I hate to say that, but I think that is the climate today in Washington, that someone who comes into a job like that and seeks to find compromises and common ground, as he did, would be viewed very harshly today in this kind of polarized society that we have here in Washington and often internationally. He believed deeply in looking for compromise. He had a very interesting formula for that, which he applied both domestically and internationally. And it went like this: if you bring people together and argue over principle, they'll never come to agreement, which, you know, when you're thinking about it, that's kind of what the Washington and Moscow were doing over the course of the Cold War. They were arguing over principle: capitalism, communism, freedom, you know, et cetera. But if you bring them together, Schultz said, and present them with a problem to solve, they tend to want to solve the problem. And so I point out in the book, George Schultz saw the Cold War as a problem that could be solved. And he had done the same thing to help desegregate schools in the South here when he was labor secretary. And so he applied that formula. You know, it was tough going. This was not what Caspar Weinberger thought ought to be done. This was not what William Clark thought ought to be done. Certainly wasn't what Bill Casey thought ought to be done. And by the way, going back to Nancy Reagan, you know, within, I guess it was about 8 months of that dinner at the Blizzard, she not only wanted to help Schultz, she knew that Bill Clark was blocking access by Schultz to Reagan. Lo and behold, suddenly Bill Clark's out of a job. He becomes Interior Secretary. Nancy Reagan was behind that.
Sure. I mean, this idea of problem solving, I just want to underscore, it's such an interesting way of thinking about this. It's hard reading this book not to conclude that, to a degree, Schultz's success and Reagan's success has something to do with they're not outsiders. Schultz is not an outsider. He's been a lot in Washington. But he's a little bit of an outsider to diplomacy and statecraft, and he's willing to think about it in a different way. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And this was true of Reagan and Gorbachev, but it was particularly true of Schultz and Shevardnadze. You know, so Shevardnadze came from Georgia, which at the time was one of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union. And Georgians, I love Georgia. I've spent a lot of time there. Georgians tend to be Mediterranean people. You know, they're gregarious, they're emotional, they're warm. They're wonderful people to spend time with. And the key to this was the first time that Schultz met Shevardnadze. He had been dealing with Andrei Gromyko, you know, the most dour person on earth. And they had had terrible arguments over things like the Soviet shoot-down of the Korean airliner in '83. Schultz goes to Helsinki to meet Shevardnadze for the first time at an international conference. He says to his wife before they go, "Why don't you come with me? I would like to establish a different kind of relationship with Shevardnadze. He's bringing his wife. You should come with me." So Schultz walks into Finlandia Hall in Helsinki, and there are 30 nations, delegations assembled there. And the hall is a kind of interior amphitheater type. The American delegation is seated in the front. It's under the French, you know, language, so U.S. is in front, Soviet Union's in back. He puts his papers down, and he slowly walks up the steps to near the top row where the Soviet foreign minister's sitting. There's a hush falls over the hall. He gets up to Shevardnadze's desk, and he shakes his hand. That was the beginning of this absolutely wonderful friendship that existed. And when you go through the Schultz papers at Stanford, at the Hoover Institution, there's a letter there, 1989, from Edward Shevardnadze to George Schultz. Schultz is out of office. Shevardnadze is still in office. And in the letter, it's a very warm, friendly letter. He refers to their relationship. He said, "George, we were kindred souls." Can you imagine Andrei Gromyko writing such a letter to some other American Secretary of State? It's inconceivable.
It's extraordinary. Let's start with a couple of questions here. We have one right here in the front row.
So I'm a former diplomat and
Please go ahead and identify
Bill
yourself.
Lawrence, American University. I'm a former diplomat and a historian. I spent a lot of time while I was a diplomat asking about former secretaries of state and just hearing the stories from the old diplomats. And I can tell you, and it's consistent with a lot of things you were saying, that Schultz and Powell were the two most beloved secretaries of state by far. by far. It's why they named the training sector. There's so many Schultz stories. So I was wondering, I know this is more a story about the man and policy in the times, but he was also an amazing manager, as Powell was, and better than all the other secretaries of state. And I was wondering if in your research you picked up some notion of how he managed. You've given some glimpses now about his personality and the labor part, but I was wondering if you could say something about
Sure.
Schultz the manager.
So, Schultz was way ahead of his time. I think the word I would apply to Schultz most of all as a manager was inclusivity. And he did some extraordinary things. The first thing he did, a lot of secretaries of state, when they're appointed, they bring in a lot of their advisors from the outside world or elsewhere, political advisors, and they rely on them. Schultz didn't do that. The first appointment he made was Raymond Seitz as his executive assistant, a senior member of the Foreign Service. And that was true throughout his term. He was surrounded, for the most part, by Foreign Service officers. As I was covering him in those days, I vividly remember the day he came down to lunch in the State Department cafeteria. I mean, since when does the Secretary of State show up in the cafeteria to have lunch with the staff? That was an indication. Another one, which is in the book, is when the Reagan White House decided to unload Eugene Rostow as the head of the Arms Control Disarmament Agency. So here's Rostow. I think he'd been a former Undersecretary of State. He'd been Dean of the Yale Law School. This is a very senior figure in American life. And the White House assigns the firing of Eugene Rostow to the personnel chief at the White House. And Schultz knows this is coming. He doesn't really want to fire Rostow, but the president's decided he's got to go. And he intercedes. And he says, no, I have to handle this. This is a respected, dignified man. He has to be told about this by the Secretary of State. So he meets with Rostow. He gives him the bad news. He comes back to see Ray Seitz, in whom he confides everything that's going on. And by the way, the Ray Seitz Journal at Stanford is an amazing document. And in the journal, he talks about the fact, he said, it was one of the hardest things I ever did. And then he sighs and he said, this is a cruel town. And so I think that sensibility was conveyed to members of the State Department. They knew that. If you talk to Jim Goodby, who was an ambassador in the arms control talks, Jim to this day remembers the day that Schultz took him over to the White House to meet with Reagan. They get into the Oval Office and Schultz says, Jim, you sit over here, and he points him to the wingback chair next to the president. That's where the Secretary of State should be sitting when there's a meeting with the president. He put Jim in that chair to honor his service. So I think that people understood that at the State Department. And I think he'd learned to be a manager in the academic world. He often said it was great training for government because when you're a dean in the academy, you can never get the faculty to agree on anything. You have to do all of the spade work to try to get consensus. And then at Bechtel, he understood. And one last thing that's worth talking about for a second, when he was a graduate student at MIT, he met a guy who'd been a senior official in the Steelworkers Union who was working at MIT. And he learned from him, this guy was a genius at doing this, empowering workers. He would go into factories where the management and unions were at a deadlock and would work out a way to get them to agree by empowering the workers, putting them at not only the bargaining table, but at the decision-making corporate table in the corner office. And George drew an important lesson from that.
Do we have online questions from online that we should be putting in here, our last couple of minutes?
Yes, okay.
So Hannah's going to read it from online, correct?
Very
No.
related, so this one will be brief. Someone asked from YouTube, can you speak more to how Schultz was able to overcome challenges with dysfunction at the cabinet level to still lead effectively?
I think the answer is, multifaceted. He got this huge boost from Nancy Reagan. And by the way, her colleagues or co-conspirators in this were Jim Baker, who was White House Chief of Staff, and Mike Deaver, who was Deputy Chief of Staff, and they all agreed with the First Lady that the president was being ill-served by these hardliners. So, and he was not shy about using that connection. In the Seitz diary, it talks about how Nancy Reagan would call him over at the State Department and say, you know, we got to get someone in there to talk to Ronnie because he's just talking to these guys and they're making him, it's making it worse and worse and worse. So he did rely on the First Lady. He built this relationship directly with the president over time. Baker and Deaver arranged for a weekly lunch with the president. And Schultz, you know, this was typical of Schultz. He said, well, you know, the national security advisor's got to come to this lunch. I don't want to do an end run around the national security advisor. Went to Reagan with this idea, and Reagan said, George, no, I don't think so. I just want to meet with you. So that allowed him to build this rapport with Reagan.
It also speaks to a certain level of caution, I think, in his own personality, which must have been.
He was bureaucratically cautious, and when the worst of the infighting was going on, he would sort of lament to Ray Seitz, you know, there has to be orderly decision making. I can't go around the National Security Council staff, which of course is exactly what he should have done and ultimately did.
But it's what they were doing to him
Yeah,
constantly as well. So just I think that's
but he was reluctant to do it
right,
because and I think that was a kind of weakness of his that he thought there has to be orderly decision making. But when you're in a disorderly administration, sometimes you have to be more disorderly than anybody else to get anything done.
Which is why he's constantly threatening to resign.
Right.
And every time his resignation is rejected by the president.
Right. And then lastly, success breeds success, right? So he starts these negotiations and the summits begin to take place and progress begins to happen. And Reagan is looking at his Secretary of State and saying, wow, you know, we're working together and we're making real progress. So I think as the years passed, he slowly but surely gained command of American foreign policy.
It's also just perseverance on some level.
Definitely.
I mean, through so many different challenges. I mean, whether the internal bureaucratic politics, you know, Reagan's dedication to SDI, the multiple crises that occurred in U.S.-Soviet relations that could have completely derailed any effort at diplomacy. I mean, he persevered.
You know, I would say to anybody who's watching this or is here who's working at the State Department or wants to go into the Foreign Service, the model of George Shultz is an important one in so many ways, but one of the words I would urge you to think about is two words: patience and persistence. He did both, and it served him very well. Many other people would have thrown in the towel along the way and said, "I can't do this. You know, I'm headed out of town."
We have time for one more question here from the audience. Let me start over here on the right, please, sir. Yeah. And maybe we can do Beatrix your question as well. Yeah.
Shall I use the mic?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. My name is Hussein Mubarak. I'm a former Egyptian diplomat. Sometimes, as you said, it is good to have a foreign minister who is out of the beltway. Both in this case, the president and the foreign minister, or the foreign secretary, was out of the beltway, so they can bring fresh ideas and they can be dealing with trying to solve issues and so on and so forth. But I think Foreign Secretary Schultz he reacted to international problems with his intuition and nature to be a slow pace reactor, and he thought that will resolve more effectively the problems of the world compared to his predecessor, who was the head of NATO, and he was known for being tempered and so on and so forth. One of the weak sides of the foreign policy of George Shultz is in the Middle East. He started very well. He was...
I don't want to launch into history. We don't have time to go into the whole history of the Middle East here.
Okay, so
right.
the only
Yeah.
question I have is, no, I just wanted to make this point, that his weak point was on the Middle East, because it ended up at the end of his term, probably with the Intifada, the first Intifada. And some writers, they think that was because he was a little bit weak on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute.
Okay,
That's it.
okay,
Thank you.
great, thank you. Beatrix, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was just wondering, since you both talked a lot about Schultz's role in ending the Cold War, if you could also speak a little bit about his approach to relations with China and Taiwan, and maybe how that might be applicable to today.
So there was a dramatic moment not long after Schultz became secretary. He startled his staff. He'd just been confirmed, and actually when you look at the Senate vote in today's Washington, it seems unreal. He was confirmed, I think, 98-0. When was the last time that happened? So he says to the staff, I'm going out to the Bohemian Grove in California, which is this summer encampment of businessmen and others. And they said, the first thing you want to do as Secretary of State, go to Bohemian Grove. And he said, I'm going because I'm hosting Helmut Schmidt, the German chancellor, or former German chancellor, and Lee Kuan Yew is coming from Singapore. Henry Kissinger is going to be there, and it will give me an opportunity to talk to these wise men about international relations. And when the encampment broke up, they went to Schultz's home at Stanford, and they sat around the dinner table, and I'll get to the China thing, you'll see. But Schmidt says to him, George, it's very dangerous right now. There is no conversation going on between Washington and Moscow. This was after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And Lee Kuan Yew says to Schultz, the Reagan administration is dealing with China in simplicities and generalities. It is not talking to the leadership in Beijing. So Schultz makes a point of trying to work out a more constructive relationship with the Chinese leadership. And the way he does that is also applicable today in some ways. He gets together with the Chinese leadership, Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese foreign minister, and they work out a plan to sort of disaggregate the issues in U.S.-China relations that were stalled, and to put together working groups to address each of those issues. Again, this comes to the pragmatic problem-solving strategy of George Schultz. And so while there were no, what I would describe as breakthroughs in U.S.-China relations in those years, and Taiwan continued to be a source of friction, just as it is today, they were able to talk through some of the strains in the relationship. And so when you look back on his period as Secretary of State, you see a relationship with China. There was not this startling kind of sea change as there was with the Soviet Union. But things kind of stabilized during that period. So it was, again, a good example of how he went to work to solve problems.
It's fascinating, and we have to bring our conversation to a close here, but let me ask you one final question. What was your favorite part about writing this book?
Well, you can imagine a journalist who's covering the Secretary of State has very limited access to him, other than an occasional tennis game. And fast forward, 30 years, and suddenly you're spending probably several hundred hours with George Schultz talking to him. You're getting access to his private papers. You're seeing the inside story of the Reagan administration. It was thrilling. And I'll tell you, the moment that really brought it home to me, was the day I went through the Cites Journal, and I got to July of 1983, and there is probably the lowest point for Schultz. He's been end run by Weinberger and Casey and the others. They've gotten the president to agree to all kinds of steps to escalate U.S. Military and intelligence activities in Central America, which was, Bill Casey's great kind of cause. Secretary of State doesn't know anything about it. And he's furious, and you can see him venting to Cites. And I turned the pages of the journal, and then wait, there's my name. And they're talking about Phil Taubman. And I realized at that moment, that he had learned about all these decisions in the stories, my scoops in the New York Times. And so you got to, you know, what a thrill. I mean, you know, it's now 30, 40 years later, and I'm discovering that, you know, I'd written these stories that had essentially infuriated the Secretary of State.
Had even more influence than you
Yeah,
thought.
much more. So, you know, the short answer is it was a kind of a joyride for me. I mean, writing a book is always a challenge. But, you know, and I should say, just so there's no misunderstanding, the deal I made with him at the outset, he asked me to do the book, he gave me access to his materials, and the deal I cut with him, I said, I'm glad to do the book, but it's your life, but it's my book. And we stuck to that. And he never tried to interfere with the book, and I would never let him interfere with the book had he tried.
Well, thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming to the Carnegie Endowment to talk to us about it today.
Thank you so much.
All right.